the floor to a big counter in the middle of that floor. There was just one person working there. And he knew Courtney, and they kind of laughed that he was back at the building. And he gave them my name, and he said, "Okay, Andy, you can walk into the teleport now." And I said, "Where is it?" I mean, I was expecting these two parentheses-shaped objects on the floor or some big Stargate device where there was nothing around you when you teleported, like the experience I had had as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. And he said, he laughed, and he said, "It's the elevator that we just came up in."
Oh, my goodness.
Really? He said, "Yeah, Scout's honor, so why don't you get in the elevator?"
Wow.
So I stepped into the elevator, and he wasn't going with me on this particular probe, my first probe up to Mars. And the door closed, and it went up about 3 stories up to the 8th floor of the building. And I heard Courtney's voice through the intercom say, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yeah." And then a couple more minutes passed, and he said, "Are you really ready?" And I got kind of exasperated and impatient, and I said to him, "Light this candle." And he basically said, "Okay." He laughed, and he had a very kind of gruff, sort of hardcore sense of humor, like a lot of career intelligence people.
Right.
A real laconic sense of humor. And he laughed, ruefully. And essentially, everything seemed normal, except I imagine what would have been halfway to Mars. It seemed to be halfway during the transit. There were some spatial effects that occurred in the elevator. The elevator, which had been rectilinear in shape, kind of got a little bit more oblate, and there was this tremendous pressure. And there were some sensations of disorientation and pressure that I didn't experience when I was jumping through the Tesla device at Curtis Wright when I was a child. And I think there must have had to have been, because the whole room went there. This wasn't jumping through a teleporter that opened up a vortal tunnel in time-space. The room itself went with me to Mars. And these are the so-called jump rooms that researchers like David Wilcock have been writing about. So what happened is, after these weird sensations and perceptions abated, and I still found myself in this elevator, it opened up, and as Courtney Hunt had described, I was in an underground facility that looked like a big sort of concrete bunker area, like maybe one of the service areas that you would find around a big, Major League Baseball field. It was sort of 1 story below ground and just this cavernous expanse of concrete, like if you were in some part of a major dam where you have workrooms and stuff to maintain the dam. And, in other words, it was an industrial site. It was totally unfurnished, just this big underground concrete facility. Okay. Like the deep underground military bases that people have reported, and some of which
we've heard about.
Right, which do exist.
Yeah.
And as Hunt had instructed me, I walked up a concrete stairway up on the right side of this cavernous room where the elevator had opened. And as he had described, the access point to the surface of Mars was provided by the eyes of a skull-like sculpture that was sitting on the surface of Mars.
Wow.
So I went up into like this dugout area, and I could see the eyes of the sculpture from behind, from being inside the skull. And I clambered up onto the eye sockets and through the skull, and I found myself on the surface of Mars, which looked a lot like Sedona, Arizona. It has sort of a rust-red terrain, a light blue, a very pale blue atmosphere, and there was one individual there to greet me. And about 5 minutes after I arrived, 2 more individuals showed up, so that there were 3 up there. 2 men and a woman about my age, maybe a couple of years older. I was 19 in 1981. So they seemed 21, 22, 23 perhaps. And they did not have crystal helmets with respiration devices in them like I did.
You had full gear.
Yes, Hunt had shown me. I think what it was Hunt had shown me how to use the helmet. He's going to put it on, and in fact, I wasn't in a suit, so the helmet closed off around my neck or shoulder area. Okay. And then I'm yelling through the microphone at them, "Can I take my helmet off?" I'm thinking, are these people Martians, and can they breathe this atmosphere? Why did Courtney give me a helmet? So they were laughing, particularly the one I was interacting with, and I took my helmet off, and I could breathe the atmosphere of Mars. It was difficult to breathe, but I didn't start hyperventilating. The best way I can describe it is, if anybody has spent a hot summer day in a smoggy city like Los Angeles at its worst, and your lungs are aching by about 7 o'clock at night. Maybe you've been swimming all day, and you have smog lung, and it's difficult to breathe. It was sort of like that. I felt a little bit lightheaded, and like I was struggling to breathe somewhat, but I could breathe the atmosphere of Mars.
Okay.
And they had become accustomed to it. So on that first trip, I essentially stood around with them for about a half hour or so outside this skull-like sculpture on the surface.
Wow.
And then I went back in and went down to the elevator, and about 45 minutes later, the elevator door closed, and I found myself back in El Segundo after about 10 minutes.
Now, who were the people that were with you at that time? I mean, were they other human life forms, or did you meet life forms that were indigenous to the Martian planet?
Well, the three people at the immediate area in front of the skull there on that first trip were human beings like you and I from Earth.
Okay.
They were, Mars staff of the CIA stationed there.
Okay.
Now, the second time I went up with Courtney Hunt, and we walked around the surface for 3 or 4 hours. And I did, in fact, encounter on that trip, nobody was there to greet us, so he walked over to this building, which was like this old adobe, sort of, again, southwestern-type construction. And when we walked onto the yard of that property, sort of the xeriscape landscape of that property, over on the left side of the house was something initially that I thought was a dog. But what it was, in fact, was a creature that had the bald head and sort of muscular shoulders of a Caucasian male, hybridized with lower extremities that were sort of grub-like. And when we entered the property, he came bounding across the property at us, kind of snarling like a human and barking like a dog at the same time.
Wow.
So much so that I actually sort of just instinctively stepped behind Hunt because I thought he was going to bite us. And got within 3 feet of us. Hunt kind of moved towards him quickly to startle him and scare him away. And he turned heel and went bounding away, wailing balefully like a dog, as if Hunt had wounded him by scaring him. And then Hunt turned to me and said, "He's harmless." We then entered the house. Actually, the screen door fell off when Hunt opened the door. It was all rusted and just literally fell off in his hand. He kind of laughed, ironically. And inside the building was a Mars colonist or explorer, somebody from CIA who had clearly been up there for months or years, who was essentially insane. I mean, he was basically suffering from exposure to the point where he had pretty much lost his mind. And when we entered the room, he started essentially evading Hunt all over the room. I think he thought he was going to be assassinated. He was definitely intimidated by our presence in the room. Maybe he didn't recognize us at first as U.S. personnel, and he thought perhaps we were some other life form that might take his life. But he was panicking, pretty much falling all over this one-room apartment, house, trying to evade us. And Courtney calmed him down, and he began babbling almost nonsensically about the people on the project who had been lost. For example, he described how one of the personnel had been eaten by the plesiosaurs that roam the surface of Mars. These are these reptiles that are sort of Loch Ness monster-shaped creatures that are carnivores, just like they were on Earth before they became extinct after the KT extinction event on Earth.
Wow!
So I had interaction with again, this was a human person who had been placed up there by the CIA, who was pretty much in a state of real psychiatric imbalance from having been up there so long, enduring the conditions and the dangers of being there. And then we walked out of his place. He asked Courtney whether he could go back with us, and Courtney said, "Not on this trip. I've got to take Andy back." So he was very, very dejected about that. Then we walked around, and I don't remember exactly the life forms we encountered because those parts of my memories are still buried. But I do remember that when we then stopped and started walking back to the skull, so we could go into the underground facility and take the jump room back to El Segundo, there were like 6 or 7 feel-like, half human, half grub-like creatures up on a hillside that were sort of barking like walruses as I was walking past them, kind of like, woo, woo, woo. And I said to Hunt, "What does that mean?" And he said, "They're saying goodbye to you."
Wow.
So some of the life forms were actually interacting, trying to communicate with me up there.
Wow.
And then we went back, and we got within about 40 feet of the skull, and I saw that a boulder on my right had moved. And then it was at about 30 feet from the skull, I saw this periscope-like neck and small head come up with an eye on it.
Oh, my goodness.
And I turned to Hunt, and I said, is that an animal? And he said, yes. And I said, we stepped a few more feet towards the skull, and I said, is it a predator? And he said, afraid so.
Ooh.
And then we stepped a couple more feet towards the skull. And he said, I tell you what, Andy, when we get to about 10 feet from the skull, I want you to run like hell and then dive through the eye sockets like you're coming into home plate in a baseball game to try to win the game.
Oh, my God.
You are, okay? And so we got within 10 feet, and he said, let's go. And we ran like hell, and I saw the thing closing on me in sort of my right field of vision. And as we dove through the eye socket of the skull, this plesiosaur-like creature, it was a very bulbous one, smacked its whole body against the eye socket of the skull. It didn't recognize, what the object was, which is, I think, why they disguised these access points to their underground civilization with what looked like rocks that human beings can identify as skulls or faces or whatever, because intelligent humanoids can identify that they can get access to the underground civilization through those points. But the less intelligent but obviously predatory creatures on the surface of Mars don't really know what they're looking at. So we kind of righted ourselves inside the eye socket there. I looked back quickly to see if it had gotten through the eye socket. It hadn't. We began to scamper down the stairwell, and I said to Courtney, is it a meat eater? And he said, you betcha. That thing has teeth all down its throat.
Oh, my God.
So I had contact not just with, non-predator species on Mars, but in fact a predator species chased us back to the skull.
Well,
now, that may have been a simulation of some kind, but I think it was actually a real risk that we
it certainly sounds that way. Now, what about higher life forms or higher intelligence? Are there higher life forms that you were made aware of?
Well, this comes from different sources, and not my two very brief trips up to Mars in 1981 at that. What I can confirm about Martian life, well, first I'd just like to say that my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, which I published last year, is the first work of science to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet. Mm-hmm. So I would urge your listeners to visit exopolitics.com and click on that paper that I published on December 12th of last year, because there's ample evidence in that paper of the humanoid creatures, the animal life forms, as well as the carved statues and built structures that humanoids have designed all over the surface of Mars. Mm-hmm. But separate and apart from that recent publication, when I was attached to Project Pegasus as a child, my dad and I went over to Curtiss-Wright again, not to teleport to Santa Fe, but they said there were some Martians over there, and they wanted to meet me. They said they're leaving after their last trip here, and they know about you, and they want to meet you. And I really couldn't get my head around what he was talking about Martians, and he finally said, son, they're human beings like us, but they're from Mars. Mm-hmm. So we went over to one of the hangars at Curtiss-Wright, and we went into a small meeting room with these three, essentially, gentlemen who looked very, very human. I've described them as essentially bald, ugly white guys. And the three of them looked like any combination of the four Three Stooges. Three of the four Three Stooges.
Oh, interesting.
Two were bald. One had a small amount of hair around his balding pattern. And they were essentially completing their shop talk there with the Curtiss-Wright personnel. Wow. And then they got up and walked past me into their ship, which was this small silver teardrop-shaped ship that had been hovering by the side of the stage-like loading ramp there in that hangar when we walked in from that side. And one of them, the last one, as they walked past me, stopped and said to my dad, he said, it was a privilege visiting your beautiful planet again and seeing you again, Ray. Thank you for introducing us to your son, Andy. And my dad very graciously said, well, it was great to see you guys again. I hope we can get together next time you visit our planet. And they walked in a kind of a strange way. They didn't walk exactly the same way as modern humans. And also their musculature was allocated in different parts of their body in a way that wasn't exactly analogous to modern human beings. I remember that. They were dressed in silver spacesuits with a red, sort of a blood-red crest on the chest with a yellow lightning bolt in it. That was sort of the spacesuit that they were wearing. Wow. And they got into this rather small craft. It